We are here at Quarryville, Pennsylvania, outside of Lancaster, and we are at the Octorara Middle Cemetery. And as you can see, it's a pretty historic and pretty amazing place. You wouldn't think that in studying Robinson Run in western Pennsylvania, we'd be standing here some 215 miles away. Certainly not with a historian with a selfie stick. But believe it or not, this is the location where the major families of the Robinson Run area will all kind of, I guess we could say, have their origin story. A lot of folks don't realize, especially who study this field, that the Robinson Run community was actually a transplanted community. That is to say, it existed elsewhere before it traveled 215 miles west. And most of the people who settle in and around that area come from right here outside of Quarryville, Pennsylvania, in the Octorara region. Now, the reason that they're here is because of the man we're visiting today, the person whose grave we're standing at right now. And this is the final resting place. This is a very special place of the Reverend John Cuthbertson. Now, John Cuthbertson was one of the most important figures in the history of the Presbyterian Church in America, because he's from originally Scotland, but he will travel throughout Ireland practicing his Presbyterian ministry, and yes, he will come here to North America. And when he comes to North America, John Cuthbertson is one of the only Reformed Presbyterian ministers in the colonies. And he will travel more or less on foot and on horseback through nearly all the colonies of the New World. And what he's doing is maintaining a rigorous schedule of marrying people, baptizing people, and proceeding over burials of people who are, again, Scots-Irish immigrants, much like himself, in the Presbyterian Church. Cuthbertson will say that he will travel some 70,000 miles in his ministry. And he'll proceed over something like 1,800 baptisms here in the New World and over 200 marriages. This is a man, John Cuthbertson, who puts in his miles, okay? He gets his steps for sure. But to be here at his gravesite and to be in this community is really a powerful moment for me, having researched these people so much. Because knowing where they end up compared to where they come from, again, is just a really special experience, and I think really critical to understanding who these people were and where their journey took them. So I want to talk a little bit about this community. We are just outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania in the 1750s and 1760s and 1770s, when we're telling this story, is a very busy place. Unlike Philadelphia and Boston and New York, which are import and export cities, Lancaster is the place in the American colonies where we manufactured things, where we made things. They made, most famously, of course, Conestoga wagons, and some of the finest gunsmiths really in the world lived in York and Lancaster, not separated by just a few miles. So for a lot of these Scots-Irish farmers, understand most of the people I just mentioned were Germans. For a lot of these Scots-Irish farmers, they were kind of on the outside looking in. They were living together. They were fiercely attached to their Presbyterian faith, but they were a people apart. They didn't have access to a lot of land and therefore a lot of wealth and opportunities that a lot of these other immigrants had. So whenever they hear about open available space in the West over the vast Appalachian Mountains, they're going to be interested in going there, and they're going to be willing to risk it all. And they do that because that kind of opportunity didn't exist here in eastern Pennsylvania, and it certainly didn't exist in Europe. So that's where a person like the Reverend John Cuthbertson comes in. If you look at John Cuthbertson's journals, it's a wonderful resource in the 18th century. He writes everything down. He's a meticulous note taker, and every burial, every marriage, and every baptism he participates in, he keeps meticulous records. I'd encourage you to look that up, because you might find a name you recognize in there. But when I was researching these documents, the names I was looking for were the people who, again, settled ultimately in the subject of our series, Robinson Run. some 215 miles away from where I'm standing right now. And you will see a lot of familiar names. The Reverend John Cuthbertson will see and interact with and even baptize some of the children of James Ewing, one of the very first people who settles in Robinson Run, originally from Maryland. He'll also marry, and this is very exciting for me, two young kids right here in Octorara Township named Gabriel Walker and Margaret Ball. And as you continue on in this series, you won't believe the role and the life that Gabriel and Margaret lead in the Western frontier. But it all begins here. Margaret Ball was tied to the Reverend John Cuthbertson legally. She was not indentured to him, that's not the correct legal term, but she was almost apprenticed to him. She was working for him. They called her a bound girl. So the fact that she married Gabriel Walker and the Reverend Cuthbertson presided over it had special significance for all of them. In fact, Cuthbertson, who was really a man on the move most of his life, even lived with Gabriel and Margaret Walker for their last few years here in Octorara Township. So this is a man that, in terms of the Reverend, and I call this episode Flock, because so many of the people we're studying and will continue to study in this series really are the product of this community here. Again, I mentioned already, James Ewing interacted with John Cuthbertson in a very meaningful way. Gabriel and Margaret Walker, they couldn't have been closer to the man. Isaac Walker, who was the younger brother of Gabriel by 2 years, his children will be baptized by this traveling Presbyterian reverend. Samuel Scott, who we're going to meet in a few episodes. Samuel Scott is from this community, the same one, but he'll interact with the Reverend John Cuthbertson at a place called the Forks of the Yauk in southwestern Pennsylvania, very far away. His child will be baptized there, and he will be married there. Not in that order, of course, in the opposite order. But this is a really special man in the history of the Presbyterian Church in America and the history of colonial America. And to be here standing right in front of his grave, to me, I always equate this to almost seeing a celebrity. Again, 70,000 miles on foot to spread the Presbyterian faith, over 2,000 baptisms, over 200 marriages in nearly every colony in North America and Ireland and Scotland. This man is truly the beginning of it all for this story. But I want to reiterate, the people we're studying knew each other before they headed west, obviously. And the nucleus of their original community for which they branched off of was right here in Octorara Township. Now, Gabriel and Isaac Walker, who we're going to have whole episodes on themselves, never really lost sight of this place. And after they settled themselves on Robinson Run, one of the ways that they benefited their community and made their money, and really the way they became pillars of that community, was by loading up pack horses and traveling 215 miles back to this spot. And what they would do is buy all the things that people on the frontier needed and didn't have. Lead, iron, tools, maybe seeds, maybe farming equipment, the basic necessities of life that they would have had here. We're going to move next to the Reverend John Cuthbertson's church. Remember, he was a traveling minister and he traveled everywhere, but he did ultimately settle here in Octorara Township. And I want to give us a good look at the church he founded, because again, that served as the nucleus community of these people. So yes, this is the story of Robinson's Run. Yes, we are 215 miles away, but make no mistake, this is the place, Octorara Township, Pennsylvania, outside of Lancaster, where it all begins. John Cuthbertson traveled around the world, preaching his version of the Presbyterian faith. And this is a little bit of a tricky conversation, but the Presbyterian Church, from the beginning of the 1600s, really through the year 1800, found themselves in a lot of sectarian turmoil. A lot of branches of the Presbyterian Church were formed, offshoots of the church, a lot of disagreements over very political things. And what you're looking at here is really the manifestation, the final location of the Reverend John Cuthbertson's Covenanter brand of Presbyterianism. One of the reasons that Cuthbertson was so in demand in the New World was because the type of Presbyterianism he practiced, and again, we called him a Covenanter, was fairly new in North America, but it lent itself well, North America that is, for a lot of the disaffected members of the church who didn't feel welcomed in the Old World. And although he traveled all the colonies far and wide, was well known, obviously a tie to the people of Robinson Run, but also a tie for most Covenanter Presbyterians in North America. This is the location where he ultimately settles. Now, the building you're seeing in front of me, you can see, is the Octorara Covenanter Presbyterian Church. And this is not the original building that John Cuthbertson created, but you can see by the sign, it was founded in the year, zoom in for you, 1753. Cuthbertson held his ceremonies here on Sundays, probably in a log cabin, maybe just sitting under a tree. And all of the people we're studying here at Robinson Run were participants in this congregation. In fact, they were vital members of it. Now, the building you're seeing here was rebuilt in 1849, about a decade before the Civil War. And it was a very quiet location. But this is the very spot that the Reverend John Cuthbertson, after all of his travels and all of the lives that he touched for the better, decided to establish his church. It's where he'd spend the rest of his life, and of course, it's where he would be buried. Now, the cemetery which we just looked at is about 200 yards away. And Cuthbertson, having traveled far and wide, again, would have been at this spot. But the thing that impresses me the most about this is that there was a community here. There were people here. If you know anything about the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, I don't want to say they lived communally, because that's a different sort of thing, but they relied entirely on each other. They had a viewpoint, they had a perspective of taking care of their own, and that meant their own families and other members of that community. And even though they could have stayed here in the 1730s with limited opportunities and limited resources, men like Samuel Scott, men like Gabriel Walker, Isaac Walker, and James Ewing bet on themselves and moved west. And again, the perils of that journey themselves are a story of their own, which I think we'll explore a little more in future episodes. But to stand here on this spot, knowing where they end up, it's a really special moment for me. This is still an active church today. The community is still vibrant and thriving. And if you pan across, you can see some of this absolutely beautiful rural farmland that they had here. Now, again, they could have stayed here, and they could have planted their wheat, and they could have planted their corn, and maybe it wasn't an ideal circumstance for them. But there was so much more available in the West that they were willing to pursue. Now, yes, they'd have to cut down the trees and manufacture and manicure the landscape to their needs. But the big important thing for the Scots and the Walkers and the Ewings, look at this, a horse and buggy, perfect. One of the things for them was that that land might be rough and it might be rugged, but that land would be theirs, and that was the key. So much of the Scots-Irish Presbyterian experience was serving, laboring under a landlord, and that was something they found to be unacceptable. So really important place for our study of Robinson Run here in Octorara Township, Pennsylvania. A nice connection to the past, but this is it. Make no mistake. This is the beginning of the journey to Robinson Run. And to be here to film it, it's again, just a real privilege for me. All right, we'll see you all on the next episode.